very harmful, both in that moment and moving forward. So I think it takes a really, strong mindset and a lot of support and intervention to be able to say, look, your performance is important to you, it's important to us, but your health and welfare comes first. And so being able to step in and kind of serve as that role has been an honor. But I will say that the negative aspects of social media can be pretty detrimental. On the positive side of it, it's an opportunity for our student athletes to showcase who they are, both as athletes, as students, and beyond. To see them express their interest and, share pieces of their lives with other people that you wouldn't otherwise know or see. So there's the blessings, there's the curses, and it's just trying to find that balance.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Man, instructions on how to, that's crazy. That's just crazy. Brad, Daniel, any thoughts? Social media, name, image, and likeness, positive or negative impact on mental health and wellness?
I'm a firm believer that social media, unfortunately, is a gift and a curse. It gives our athletes the ability to keep up with friends, family, far and away. But it also gives access to them as individuals, and it's almost like an extension. Wherever they are, their phones with them, their own social media on these social media sites, and a lot of them just can't help to read everything that comes across their timeline as it relates to them, and it could be very damaging. As Abby said, it's some of these people get behind these screens and they say anything, and they tear these kids down. It's not just them, it's their family that sees these things too. So it has a lasting impact. They really carry, because when things don't go as they would like to, they're the first ones to be aware of that situation. So going on and seeing that, it's a very tough situation. But with NIL, it's huge because it allows them to use these platforms as well to create monetary avenues for themselves, for their family, and some may not have a professional pathway, but putting all this work and this time here gives them the opportunity to make that possible for themselves and their family. Some individuals are able to make life-changing money in the 4 years that they're here. So it's a blessing as well. But again, talked about the divisiveness of COVID. This is something that could be divisive as well, because you have somebody that's making having these opportunities, and this person beside them doesn't get those same opportunities. So that becomes, or can become, a situation that can break up some teams, break up some friendships. Fortunately, haven't seen a lot of it, but it's something that we have to do a better job of paying attention to. And they're doing a great job on the education piece and having people around them, because there's always going to be, especially these major universities, going to be lurkers trying to take advantage of our young student athletes. So just have to be careful with watching that.
Yeah, Brad, I really appreciate the part that you brought in about family. Because that can provide a certain boost to one's self-esteem, self-concept, identity as a son, or even a father if they are, or a mother if they have children, which also impacts their mental health and wellness. But before Daniel chimes in if he wants to, what I hope our audience is understanding again is this: there's so many dimensions. There's the biological dimension, the social dimension, the psychological dimension, even the spiritual dimension. And when we're assessing and looking at the mental health and wellness of our college athletes, we have to take the time to look at all these things. They may be more prevalent for our Pacific Islander, or our Black, or our white, or our Asian college athletes. It may differ across gender, but we have to take the time to look at all of these issues. Daniel, did you want to add something on this front?
No, I'll just say that I think Abigail kind of alluded to it before, but just, I always teach my student athletes to, whatever it is you do with social media, just make sure you're incorporating some level of balance. The reason we have things like a social media cleanse is because people get too crazy with social media. So, sometimes, as we would detox with substance use, for instance, we do need to kind of detox in other things that can be toxic, such as social media. The flip side of that is I think social media, and particularly NIL, I think can be a great benefit to student athletes, particularly in the area of personal identity development, right? As a young person, you're already trying to figure yourself out in college. And I think social media oftentimes can be a platform and kind of a support system to kind of promote that growth and development. But we also know that sometimes the image you present, right, your public identity doesn't necessarily equal your private identity. And I think oftentimes the public confuses that, right? What they see on social media, they think is the person. And so again, as I would kind of, give counseling to my student athletes, just make sure that when you're posting on social media, on some level, you are kind of risking your privacy, right? As much as you may think this is just my public image and I'm not really putting my personal business out there, people, the public perception are not always going to see it the same way. But overall, I mean, just what everyone else said, I think there is a gift and a curse element to the whole social media concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, when I was a college athlete, we didn't even have cell phones. We had big phones that looked like pocketbooks. And interesting time we're in now. Look, we are on the downswing. Our time has just flown by. Oh my gosh, we could sit here and talk forever. I know we could. So I sent you the questions in advance, but I'm gonna throw out 3 questions and we can sort of close this session. Let's see if we can close it out in 3 minutes. Kirsten, I know we're behind, but this stuff is rich. It's like a nice piece of chocolate cake, and I just want to make sure that I savor all of it. So any comments with regard to sort of when we think about mental health issues related to one's ethnicity, to their gender, or if you want to talk about some best practices, sort of that you've begun to implement or you feel will benefit college athletes and that our audience should know about. So gender, race, or best practices. And we'll close out this session.
Okay, I will start with, I guess, just some thoughts about best practices, and then hopefully we'll be able to get back around to comments about race and gender, which are really important areas for myself and for my practice and for us to consider as clinicians. I think one thing that I found to be really helpful that we instituted at Michigan a while back and we've just enhanced over the last year is the importance of awareness and education. So we have our Athletes Connected program, but for each team this year, we're doing a mental health 101 in that first part of the semester, making sure that our students have the awareness and insight about mental health related signs and symptoms and indicators. I think the other thing that we found that should be a standard of practice for all of us is being present. We have a large number of student athletes that as clinicians will never make it into our door, but that doesn't mean that we don't make it into theirs. So going to practices every single week, making sure that we are available, because we know that when you have a relationship, relationships help improve mental health outcomes. And so that is something that we have advanced this year, something that we'll continue to do. Also at Michigan, and you all can check this out online, we have peer-to-peer models. We have different resources that are out there and available that our student athletes become very aware of during their time here at our institution. And a lot of that has come with the new groups that we're providing to them. So whether it's restorative yoga, injury support group, thank you, Emma, we got that information from you when you were at Texas. And then we now have a sleep group that really focuses more on cognitive behavioral for therapy for insomnia, so the CBTI sleep group. So really making sure that when we do assessments and evaluations for our student athletes, that they're comprehensive and we can figure out themes and trends and then provide services to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Daniel, Brad, this last question we have for this session?
I'll just talk about some of the work that I've done, particularly for our male student athletes, and also even more specifically, our male student athletes of color. Back in the day, I used to run some anger management groups, and interestingly enough, it was always predominantly men, which I think, we can spend a whole session on that, right? Discussing why that is. A lot of my male clients that I've worked with, and by the way, before athletics, I was in the College Counseling Center, so I did some general work there with the general student population. But, I find that men, and particularly men of color, I think it's harder to kind of engage them. For one, it's harder for them to come through our doors. And I think Abigail made mention of that. I think at the top of the list, as far as barriers, is probably stigma, and specific to people of color and people of minority status. I think that rings even louder. So one of the things that I would try to do to engage people, because I knew they were already kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, was to set up activities. So I used to use the conference room in the CAPS, the College Counseling Center building, and I used to set up just very, basic stuff that, for the most part, generally speaking, guys would typically like to do. So I set up a PlayStation. I had cards. I had other kinds of board games, and so each and every group we had a different activity, and this was kind of a non-directive, non-threatening way to kind of pull them in. And so what I found was that in the middle of playing a Madden game, that they were more likely to open and talk about what's going on in their personal lives. So that's one of the things that I found to be helpful for me, is you have to kind of meet them where they're at. And again, focusing particularly on men of color. So not even bringing them into the building or to the office, sometimes going to their practice, as Abigail mentioned before, right? And kind of meeting them there and starting the process there. I think you have to be creative when you're working with athletes. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to get up and running within the athletics department, is doing some groups for, particularly for men, and particularly for men of color. It also gives me a little bit of a break, because I get to do fun stuff like play Madden. So it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Oh, that's real talk, Daniel. That was just real talk. Can't even say nothing. Well said. Well said.
Just really two things. The first thing is just the communication piece. Making sure that coaches are equipped with certain tools. If they see things, they're communicating with the athletic trainers. Because as clinicians, we're going to have communication with athletic trainers. We do a really good job. We have a system here where they can put the referral into a system and it gets to us. We usually get individuals in 24 hours, 24, 48 hours. Academics, they can go into that portal as well. Having a system that works, the presence is important too, but we spend so much time here, in our clinics, and on an individual basis, it's hard for us to get out to practice sometimes, but when I can, I try to do that. Just to have a presence. I think that's very important. But also just the representation. We need at these different institutions, we need clinicians, we need doctors, we need psychologists that look like our student athletes, on all sides, because that gives that sense of comfort. And I think that's important for our individuals of color more than anything, to have someone they feel like they can connect with, they can talk to, that talks like them, looks like them. And I think that's going to be a huge factor going forward to close some gaps.
Daniel, Abigail, Brad, thank you so much. I mean, we could go on and on, but we want to move to the second part of our panel. We've got about 19 questions. And to the audience, we are going to have a question and answer session after the second half. Brad, Abigail, Daniel, I'm not sure if you're able to hang around, but you're certainly welcome to do that, so that I'm sure these 19 questions are targeted towards, things that you can answer. But thank you again. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Before starting our second segment, I want to encourage everyone to click on the Drake Group link that's being provided in the chat room to learn more about what we do. Not only am I the founder of Athlete Talk and work with athletes and advocates for education, athletes and advocates for social justice in sports, but I'm also a Drake board member. Thank you. Also, please know that following our session, we are going to be sending all of you a Q&A that covers any of the questions that we don't have an opportunity to answer, and some information on our next webinar. On November 4th, we will tackle the topic of transgender issues in women's sports, featuring Olympians Donna Deverona, Martina Navratilova, who is one of my all-time favorites, as well as Joanna Harper, among our other panelists. And so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our second half, our panelists, our superstars for the second half. And we have, first of all, we have Dr. Nikki Moore, who is Vice President and Athletic Director at Colgate University. So happy that Nikki is here. Dr. Charles Small, who is the Senior Associate Athletic Director for Student Services at Iowa State University. And we also have, and I hope I pronounced this right, Jamari Brown, who is the Director of Student Athlete Programs and Compliance at the Atlantic Coast Conference. I'm gonna give you kudos because y'all can't see people clapping. But like I said, this panel is just really incredible. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being here again. Charles, Nikki, Jamari, and I hope y'all don't, calling you by your first names, but I like to open up with the same question that I asked our clinicians. Sort of for you, from the seats that you are sitting in, what mental health issues or issues surrounding mental health with college athletes resonate most with you?
I'm happy to hop in on this one. I don't know that my answers would be too different from our clinicians, other than, I think adjustment disorders probably leads the list right now. As I'm talking with coaches and hearing them reflect on how things are going right now, we certainly have student athletes, particularly in the sophomore class, who, in some ways we like during COVID over the last 2 years, we set the bar pretty low in some ways. Academically, we know grade inflation is up. Athletically, our coaches are being very sensitive about how much time, and how that was happening. And now, we've just kind of thrown them back in some ways, back into normal without on-ramping. So I do think that the adjustment disorder piece is up a bit. Depression, anxiety, I think identity development issues around race, gender, career identity development, athlete identity, even sort of connections with family. Grief was mentioned, and then I think also substance abuse and body image disorders are also pretty common and still hanging around.
Oh, thank you, Nick.
I mean, I'll jump in too. One, thank you for having me on the panel. I definitely agree with Nikki's comments. I think athletics, we're dealing with 18 to 24-year-olds, and we're a microcosm of college students in general. So you see a lot of similar issues where for 18 to 24-year-olds, there's a lot of issues that go undiagnosed. And so they present themselves kind of this lifespan development piece. What I think is different for college athletics is oftentimes it's playing itself out in a public sphere. So you have social media, you have kind of the public knowing a lot of what's going on in these young people's lives. And so I think that adds a whole different level of how do you manage and make sure that the student athletes have well-being. But I also agree on the whole identity development piece, just making sure that there's not identity foreclosure when it comes to only looking at the athlete piece of their identity, and also just the transitions. How are they transitioning through different phases?
Yeah, no, thank you, Charles. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with what Charles and Nikki said. The first kind of two that jumps to my mind from conversations that I have with student athletes is body image issues and substance abuse. I was actually surprised, about the body image issues because, I thinking it was a thing of the past, but it's something that's really still out front, very present with our student athletes for multiple reasons, right? I think social media definitely has a say in that, but I also think some of the challenges and pressures from their coaches and performance has some say in it as well. And it affects men and women equally is what I'm experiencing and seeing.
Oh, no, I appreciate that, Jamari, because I've definitely been having body image issues. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I don't know how much weight I gained during COVID. I'm still trying to outrun it. But my second question, because you all are, administrative level, right? Conference level, school level. Let's talk a little bit about some of the barriers to providing and or accessing effective mental health services, right? Because one of the things that I appreciate from our first group is that, there's a system in place. We're trying to put systems in place for our athletes. So could you talk a little bit about some of the barriers or facilitators to effective mental health services in college athletics?
Yeah, I'll jump in from a conference perspective and then let Nikki and Charles jump in from a campus perspective because they're definitely boots on the ground, really dealing with it on a day-to-day level. I think the value that the conference brings to its members and member institutions is providing that platform to provide awareness, education, to kind of break the stigma, right? Stigma is definitely a barrier to mental health intervention. And so as much as we can provide that platform to promote mental wellness, I think that kind of helps, break the stigma. The other thing is, providing opportunities to promote what they're doing on campus, right? Sharing best practices amongst one another, right? What's working, what strategies are working, what policy is working, what resources are working. And then the last thing as it relates to resources is collectively sharing resources, right? Are there opportunities? Are there platforms? Are there people out there that multiple institutions, multiple schools can utilize to help bring better and more effective mental health opportunities to their student athletes?
And Jamari, may I ask really quickly, how many conferences have someone like you working in this space?
So I know for sure, I think there are 3 at the Power 5 level now. So ACC, the SEC has someone very similar to mine. And then the Pac-12, I think, is in the middle of hiring someone in a similar role that's focused really on the student athlete welfare side of working with their member institutions and student athletes directly.
Gotcha. Nikki, Charles?
One of the barriers that comes to mind for me is like normalizing maladaptive coping behaviors. When I do think on some level, the normalization of smoking and marijuana is perhaps also kind of helping to delay in some cases actually seeking help for, and I think drinking has always been around as a maladaptive approach, but those are sometimes coping mechanisms as opposed to seeking support for actual sort of mental health distress. So that's one that comes to mind. I think the actual availability of resources and stigma, and also the availability of sort of relatable or clinicians and providers who really understand the experience of a Black student athlete, or really understand the experience of a student athlete, and are trained and knowledgeable of the cultural identity of being an athlete. When that's not there's a sense of they don't get me, they don't understand what I'm up against, and so there's a quick dropout rate. I think time limitations. There have been several questions in the Q&A about time limitations and time demands on student athletes, and some of those are, that's a real thing, and I think there's a real perceived sense that in some student athletes, I don't have time to take on one more thing to address this thing in a proactive and healthy way.
Yeah, no, great point. Great point. Because that therapy, that self-care, all those things take time, right? You don't wave a magic wand when they come in your office and everything's okay. Absolutely. Charles?
Yeah, I agree with Shamari and Nikki, and just want to highlight, the importance of coordinated care. So, oftentimes there may be issues, and if you approach it in a fragmented way, you're just not getting at it holistically. And so, with our student athletes, how going beyond just what's presented or what brings them in to the intake meeting, how are we coordinating services, coordinating care, to highlight kind of what Nikki and Shamari said to meet a lot of those needs. So I think it's just important, and having a strategy to having coordinated care is important.
Yeah. Hey, Charles, can we stay there for a minute? And like from your perspective as an administrator, who are some of the stakeholders in coordinated care? Who are the people who need to be in the know and things like that?
I think, from a macro level, you want to make sure you have systems in place. So we often have discussions around who's the initial touch point, where is that intake happening, and do we have an efficient way for referral? At Iowa State, we take the approach of we have a person with a counseling background, but their role is more case management, just because there's such a quick turnaround in athletics in terms of communicating. So we have someone in-house in terms of case management, but we have a community of providers, folks on campus, folks within the community, a network of providers, and we do the referral. So for us, we talk a lot about what are our systems, and then based on those systems, how are we communicating from those systems? So one piece of it is, how do you communicate with the coaches? How much information do they need? As your sport administrators, what's appropriate to share? And so the fact that we have that intake person for us has helped, because they're the communicator within our athletic department, but they also have the background and the licensures to coordinate with our medical folks and also the counselors in the community and on campus.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Can I add really quickly? Really good points. And, another thought is to do some proactive education with coaches, even with athletic trainers, perhaps that maybe might not have a lot of education on mental health issues. But if you're doing some of that education on the front end, when you have an issue, people are in a much better position to be prepared to be a cooperative and collaborative partner in that coordination. If they're coming to it cold, it's much harder to get someone caught up to speed, I think.
Yeah, no, a great point. That those really are some great points again, because I think that as we evolve in terms of addressing mental health in athletics, whether it's college, professional, high school, we have to realize how to build this from a macro standpoint, the infrastructure. And we also have to understand sort of the rubber band and the glue, like Nikki alluded to, the education that's going to hold it together, right? Especially if we don't have a person like Shamari at a conference level. How do we hold all that together? So I really appreciate that. And please, I definitely have to give this esteemed panel some time, just in case there's some things that I don't cover. But turf wars between counseling centers and athletic departments. I'm even gonna throw in there, sometimes we got turf wars because academic support's trying to do some counseling and they ain't supposed to be doing it. So let's just throw out the term out there, turf wars, wherever they exist in terms of mental health and our college athletes. And please share your thoughts about observations or how we evolve from that.
Happy to hop in on this one. So yeah, I think you bring up some really good points on it. It feels a little self-promoting because I don't intend it to be, but one of the things years ago that we put together in part to help with this was sort of a continuum of care thing, is like model where, on one, it's a spectrum, right? We all are on the spectrum somewhere with every sort of mental health issue. On any given day, I have different levels of sadness. I have different levels of anxiety. Sometimes it crosses over into clinical. oftentimes it's in sort of just normal stuff. And for every sort of place on that continuum, there's a variety of people that are appropriate and trained and effective at helping. So your academic counselor, is probably really effective and helpful at helping someone who is managing some stress around, I don't know, a family member who is temporarily ill and they're having to work through some things, and it's into the problem solving and they're doing some basic coaching. That's all really appropriate. It's sort of understanding and having everyone be educated on when does a set of symptomology move from one place on that spectrum to one where, okay, I'm now outside of my area of competence. But if we never talk about, mental health and sort of how mental health works and that there are actually interventions that help people move through some of these things, then no one's really very well educated on how to navigate, that spectrum, both of symptomology, but also of care.
Thinking about some tools we can develop here. Oh, no, I love that. I love that. Charles, Jamari, in terms of, the turf wars that can occur on campuses or within athletic departments?
No, I think they're very relevant and they happen. I go back to systems. And so as an athletic department, really bringing in different groups and talking through systems and getting input on and recommendations on how the system should look. But then I think that offers clarity on roles and what their role is within the system. So, for example, when you're dealing with the counseling service center on campus, we've had conversations about how they approach care on campus, what's their strategy. And for example, we identify needs that are unique to our student athletes, and we were willing also to go into partnerships and invest resources to essentially pay for protected time, right? And so in that one example, it didn't necessarily fit the model that campus used, but to meet our needs, we were willing to invest some resources for protected time, knowing that they're the people in our community that deal with the 18 to 24-year-olds and college students, and just highlighting that they're actually the experts in various areas as it relates to college students, but also knowing that outside providers may have expertise that are relevant for different situations. So, we bring our providers together, we talk about strategy, but then within that, we identify different roles. You have a team physician who may oversee the medical care of that team. And so what is their role in these different situations? And then also, what are our priorities? And part of that being giving student athletes agency. So we talk a lot about self-care plans and making sure the student athletes have some agency in the process. And then we try to play that out before it's real time with actual situations.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Jamari, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Not a lot, because I think Nikki and Charles hit it on the head, but I'll just add the role that coaches play within the whole landscape, right? Being probably having the most power or authority and most influence of our student athletes. They can either be a barrier or they can be a promoter, right? And so as we do a better job of educating our coaches around the healthcare models and what our student athletes have opportunity for, it's really important. I think it's also important for our coaches to make sure that they're getting the care that they need, right? As our student athletes see and understand and know that their coaches are getting care and taking care of themselves in a holistic manner, they'll be much more willing to engage and get the support themselves, right? A lot of the resistance for our student athletes or the hesitation for our student athletes is how they're going to be viewed by their coaches, coaches and teammates for that matter. But I think, coaches definitely have a role as it relates to the care of student athletes. So, the education is one, but then also just making sure that they're taking care of themselves is key as well.
Yeah, I'm so hopeful that coming out of this pandemic that, a lot of coaches have stepped back and sort of, whether it's impacted their family, whether it's impacted their athletes, that have really taking a second look at mental health. I think that I'm hopeful of that, and hope that's one of the positive benefits. I want to move on because we've got about 6 minutes. Man, time flies when you're with world-class panelists. I'm gonna tell you that time flies. But before we move on to this question of equity, I want to just take a quick time out and see if there's anything that's come to mind that we haven't touched on. That you just really, Emmett, I want to talk about this now. Anything at all that you wanted to share before we go on to this question about equity? Okay.
I was just going to add on that last one with collaborating across campus, because none of us can do this on our own with only like we really need to have a large sort of set and network of resources available to student athletes. But athletics has a lot of assets that don't cost us really anything that we can activate to help those campus partners. I think sometimes athletics can be perceived as a taker, like we demand this or we demand that, or we expect that you should serve us in these certain ways. How can, use timeouts in basketball games or any game to recognize campus partners? How can you activate games for like mental health awareness games, or to elevate the services that are available on campus? Or, how can you, for example, if you're going to do a group, an injured student athlete group, how can you pay for burritos through your trade or something? Like all of those things are things that we can do to, I think, help with those turf wars and work on collaboration.
That's a great point, Nikki, because then I think about, how engaging in community service, helps. It's this transactional process, right? Or the things that can happen with in-game promotions. That is an incredibly important point. Whether it's health disparities or mental health disparities, they exist. And when we think about disparities, we think about equity. And do you have any thoughts with regard to, mental health services for college athletes? We can add coaches, administrators, and equity. What's uneven right now, and how are we going to even things up and get it back in balance? Any thoughts?
There's a lot. When you just think about the what many of us experienced last year of doing our regular job and then doing a COVID job on top of it, and how stressful that felt at times. I think in some ways that is at least a window into surely what it's like to be a human, and then to layer on racism, layer on sexism, layer on other things where you're sort of having to do this additional job of managing the stressors associated there, and so they're all, we could spend an entire session on what can we try to do about that, but I think being aware of it is a big deal, and then really trying to bring in people that are culturally similar and aware practitioners, and helping to address some of the really practical things, financial barriers when that's a situation. Use SAOF whenever we can to try to help level that playing field. So those are just, I guess, a few things that come to mind with equity.
Thank you, Nick. Jamari, Charles, any thoughts? Equity on any level when we talk about mental health in college sports?
I can jump in. I really agree with Nikki's comments on when we just look at the social climate, and there are so many ramifications as it relates to mental health. And I do think there's a lot more research out there to help ground those decisions. So when you're talking to colleagues and talking to administrators, I think bringing in that, the research shows that these type of issues around social justice, these type of issues around sexism, racism, have health effects. So if we talk about well-being being a priority among our student athletes, it's imperative that we address these type of issues in that context. And, I always try to tie it back to what are the priorities of the department, and what are the goals. And if you can ground it in kind of the well-being and mental health piece, I think that's it helps for people to make the connection as to like, why is it important and what is in it for me. And so I think those are some things, and we have more information available so that we can frame a lot of those issues in that manner. And then also I just think availability of services. So we have international students, we have people from different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, obviously different ethnicities. And so how do we address those issues in creative ways to make sure we have the right services available?
Yeah, Charles, that last point was exactly what I was thinking, right? Like, how are we delivering our services, right, and programming, right? Are we doing it in a variable type of way that addresses, all the various needs of student athletes, whether it's small group dynamic, the one-on-one sessions, or even using digital resources and mental health care models to address the student athletes and their needs. I think at the end of the day, there has to be some type of variety as to how we're providing resources and supporting our student athletes that can provide the opportunity for student athletes to kind of pick and have that choice for what works best for them, to ensure that they're getting the care and having that autonomy for themselves and their own care.
Yeah, I love all of the comments that you made. In particular, Charles, you bringing up the issue of international student athletes. I'm teaching a social justice and sports class now, and there are a number of international students who are introducing issues about social justice in sports that I never thought about. And just finding clinicians who are culturally sensitive, across the spectrum is just so hard to do. I'm recalling the announcement for a clinician at UConn and the way that it was even framed. They framed it as being so important. As we close, because I'm 4 minutes over and we'll be cognizant of time, we're gonna have about 26 minutes for questions. But I wanna end this on a positive note, and not that it hasn't been positive, but sometimes we talk about mental health disorders and then we got to talk about the wellness. So what are some of your best ideas, or what are you doing to keep your staff encouraged, whether it's coaches, trainers, team doctors, or your mental health providers, or even yourselves? Because we got to engage in self-care too. What are some of the things clinically or administrative you're doing in that space to sort of keep people making sure that they're pouring into themselves and that you're pouring into them?
I'll jump in and then let Charles and Nikki jump in. One of the things that we've done here for our staff at the ACC is one, provided the COMAP. We've done a conference-wide deal, but made sure that we covered our conference office staff. But then the other thing was, even at our level, people are still needing to be educated around mental health and mental wellness. And like it's been said before, the pandemic opened everyone's eyes. And so as opposed to providing what we'll call counseling, we're calling it coaching, right? So providing coaching to our staff members and however they need it, right? So whether it's more professional, more mental, more, whatever their needs are, is being addressed. And it's been well received, right? Just to provide that care to them. And then the other thing is just kind of sharing, like right now, one of the biggest shows out on TV is Ted Lasso. This season's Ted Lasso has a huge mental health and counseling component to it, that we're just sharing, right? And just kind of opening people's eyes to this show that's hilarious, but then also has some realness that could be really applicable to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis in collegiate athletics.
Those are great ideas, Jamari. I think in athletics, it's always great to celebrate wins. And so I think we do so much and it's go, go, go. Do we take time to really celebrate wins? And I think you can be creative in how you define wins. It's not always just those kind of lag measures that happen after the fact. It could be, every quarter we have certain goals that we want to meet. And they may not go highlighted, but we know internally that they're important. They're going to lead to the overall outcomes that we want, which is student and athlete well-being. So just celebrating those. And I've also, in some other places, used FedEx days. So the whole idea is that you take a day out the week, take a day out the month, however you want to frame it, and think about how you are going to push forward the department, your area, your units. But you know what? Do it in a way that is best for you. Go take a walk around the lake. You know, go work out so that way that you're fresh mentally. And so take a day out. Think about how, you know, you're still working. You're thinking about the organization, but also it's that flexibility to know that we need to have integration and balance in our lives. And then you come together and share ideas, right? And so that way, when you're strategically planning through how do we get better, people have buy-in, people are able to share ideas, but it's also a way to say, you know, take some time and not necessarily just be in the office to do it.
Those are great ideas. One thing we've done with student athletes is develop a student or a wellness advocates group. So it's sort of like SAC, but it's self-selecting. So each team has 1 or 2 representatives. The wellness advocates gather on a monthly basis. They learn about resources that are available on campus. They learn about mental health and you know, recognizing concerns and referral, and then become a resource to a peer resource to their team. They're not peer counselors, but resources. That has been a really good thing for us here and in low cost. And then from a staff standpoint, your all's ideas were fantastic. One that's come to, more to my attention lately is what can you also take away? What can you stop doing in your department? So can you get coaches and athletics directors to stop sending emails on the weekends, or to stop sending text messages on weekends or after hours, unless it's like truly an emergency. And, you know, we have this loose set of boundaries in athletics where our lives and our work really do sort of intertwine. And so that can get out of hand super quickly. So doing some self-check and then encouraging your division, your department to do that too, I think could be a really powerful, even though it seems kind of simple.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome, Nikki, because I thought about the same things. You know, part of it is stop doing some things, take some things off your plate. I want to thank each of you, and I want to see if Brad and Daniel, you want to join us. We're going to have about, and again, my apologies, but the information was so rich. We're going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A if y'all can hang around. Katie's going to join us there. Katie, I want to join in. Katie's also been monitoring the Q&A. And y'all know I'm over the hill now, so I'm fading a little bit, but I'm trying to hang in here and process all of this. Katie, we got some questions?
Yes, we do. This has been such a fantastic discussion so far. Thank you all so much to our panelists and to our audience members who are asking questions. It's been super enlightening. I'm a former college athlete who dealt with some mental health issues in college, so it's good to see this conversation continuing and just continuing to evolve and become you know, more mainstream and less taboo. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to go on ahead and refer to the Q&A. If anyone hasn't asked any questions there, go ahead and throw them in there. We only have about 20 minutes, so we're going to do our best. And I'm going to go on ahead and start with a question from Oren, who is talking about NCAA time limits and how they're unenforced. So his question is, do we need structural reform, like reducing practice and travel time, to help college athletes be in a better mental health space? And what might that look like?
I'm going to throw in another idea. I mean, right now, the NCAA structure is super all up in the air. So who knows how that's going to work. And introducing a reform on this front, I think, doesn't have much likelihood right now. But I think something that I think has been helpful for us, we have a system, or you have bought into the system, the Real Response tool, that is a way that student athletes can anonymously report issues, converse with administrators, and so they can let us know of concerns and we can address them kind of in this back channel way. And I think it's provided a good layer of accountability in some ways for coaches, because coaches don't want to be called on it. And so when we have had an issue here or there, it's allowed us to either clarify what's going on or address it more directly. So I do think that anyway, we enforce them pretty well, I think.
Had another question, and this is from Sydney. I don't know if I was supposed to say her name, but this is what it is. What signs should coaches and athletes look for when deciding to seek help? And I'm assuming seek help for their college athletes. So I'm gonna shorten this up a little bit. What signs should coaches look for, when they're trying to seek help, or they think they should seek help for their college athletes?
I'll chime in, Emmett. Thing that jumps to mind first is just any change in normative behavior. So if somebody is generally bubbly and outgoing and all of a sudden you see them kind of pull away and not socialize as much, for instance, any significant change in behavior, I would say, is probably some type of warning sign. So that's the thing that jumps to mind. Obviously, there's mood symptoms that you can look for, but I think for coaches, because you tend to know your players and you obviously spend a lot of time with them, I would just say if you see any change in behavior or behavioral attitudes, that would be a red flag for me.
Yeah, I think that's good, baseline practice right there. And also asking questions, related to any changes to try and find sort of the source, or if there's an alternative explanation for those. I'm sorry, Nikki, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I know I interrupted you. I guess I would also suggest for coaches to be aware of their own sense of competence. So like when a coach feels like, I don't know what to do with this kid anymore, or, everything I've done has not helped, or whatever, like that actually may be a really good sign that, in fact, you are, they do need something beyond the help that you can provide. And so actually go ahead and address it. And sometimes we're worried that people, whether you're talking about suicide or you're talking about something else, that by speaking it, that somehow that's going to instigate it or stimulate a problem. In fact, most of the time we know that people are really relieved when someone will speak into whatever sort of stress or distress they're experiencing.
Can I add real quickly, just in addition to what was said, just going through the process of building relationships, because sometimes just the business side, we get so caught up in that, as coaches, as admin, just going through the process of building relationship, building rapport, so you have an idea when something is off, instead of, just strictly focusing on the athlete, focusing on the person.
Yeah, there's another question about that in the chat, just talking about the relationships between athletes and coaches, because athletes do tend to be very driven, and they want to show their coaches that they're hardworking. And I think this also applies to academics as well. We don't want to come off to our professors as, the dumb jock stereotype that can be very hard to shake. And so Madison asks, as an athlete, how can you prioritize your mental health without it coming off as a lack of commitment to coaches?
Y'all just jump in, because I'm gonna keep. Oh, go Charles. Sorry.
Well, like I said, at a macro level, I think about culture of the team, culture of the department, and that education really becomes important, because I think the education around the importance of mental health and performance as it relates to having good mental health. I think that's just so important for the coaches to be able to understand and manage those type of situations. So I think it falls back on culture and education around really prioritizing mental health.
Charles mostly hit on it. What I was going to say, it's actually a strength to address it. I mean, just like if you had a left side weakness, you talk to your strength coach about, how are we going to address this issue. But I think it's important to note too that when a student athlete is in distress, that perhaps encouraging them to have a peer help them have that conversation is not a bad idea, because sometimes when you're in distress, it's hard to even like put it together to have that like strength focused approach.
I think the other thing that I see a lot in college athletics is that, different teams have different structures with regard to how assistant coaches are integrated, whether they're mentors, whether they're, a voice for the team. I think that's also a strategy that I see. Mm-hmm. Any others? We got quite a few questions here, but here's one, and it's from Oren. And Oren teaches at Duke, and he's got a lot of context here, but I think his bottom line question is, do we need structural reform like reduced practice time, travel time, to help college athletes in a better mental health space? So I'm gonna reformat that a little bit and say, maybe, are there some reforms that you would recommend, or that you think, or that you ponder, that would help us in terms of the mental health of our athletes, coaches, and/or administrators?
I think the one thing that's important is that each student athlete's mental health is specific to their own needs, right? So we have individualized treatment plans, and each of those plans, we have to take into consideration workload, time management, the specific disorder in which the student athlete is navigating at that point in their life, and the resources that they have access to. So I will say that, for the student athletes that many of us have worked with, it's case by case. Sometimes we do need to make modifications in their training schedules or their participation in sport. And I think it's important that the student athlete's voice is at the forefront of that, because they're the one that's going to be able to report like what they believe they can navigate and manage, in addition to us checking symptoms and evaluating, how they're functioning.
Kay, do you have another question for us? You want me to fire away?
Yeah, I've been seeing a big theme in the Q&A about name, image, and likeness and mental health. And I think that bleeds really well into a question from Rebecca about social media, since, we're probably going to be seeing a lot more social media activity in light of NIL. And even separate from NIL, college athletes have been on social media for quite some time. So she wants to know, what advice do you have for athletes to minimize the impact that social media can have on their mental health?
Limit exposure.
I really think what's interesting, I'm not a panelist, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn last night. I really think, what's interesting is like 10, 12 years ago, we were in athletics, we were trying to teach college athletes how to stay off of social media, right? That was, MySpace was out and those types of things. So I really think it's really an issue of etiquette and really going back to thinking before you hit send, those types of things. But I want to go back to the strengths-based perspective. I mean, this gives our athletes an opportunity to show their other authentic identities. And I really think and I think the athletic departments are doing a great job, given whomever they're working with their name, image, and likeness piece, but just sort of teaching them etiquette and teaching them to explore other identities and how to demonstrate or depict those other identities in social media. I think that it can have, a positive effect on wellness myself.
So it's almost like, how do you amplify that, right? So it's, what are your values, aspirations, goals, desires? And if your NIL or your social media align with that, then how do you make sure that you're conducting that and moving forward with a good way? And when it doesn't, then it's, okay, how can you scale back? And like Nikki said, like limit use, right? Mm-hmm.
And just to piggyback off what Emmett was saying about just being more mindful, you know, we teach a lot of mindfulness practices. And so, you know, one of the groups that I've run in the past is mindful eating. And so along the same vein, I mean, it's teaching students to be on social media mindfully as opposed to mindlessly, which I think happens more often than not, right? They just kind of open up their phones and, you know, without even really consciously paying attention, they're opening up their social media apps and they just start scrolling. So it's more about teaching them mindfulness to practice going on social media mindfully, right? And that also includes things like posting, as Emmett mentioned before. So I think it's more, you know, we know that this is a thing and it's never going to change. It's not going away, and we have to kind of work with, you know, what's in the room. And so just teaching some mindfulness exercises, I think that could be a helpful strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I think this is an interesting question. I think we hit a little bit of it, but this is the way it's phrased is intriguing. And what mental health challenges are caused by recruiting college athletes who are not necessarily academically prepared?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know we talked about the online piece. You know, I know we've talked about, you know, buses, classes, and professors like me who are confused about online class. I know we talked about that. What about the athlete who's not quite academically prepared? What types of mental health challenges does that bring about? I think that's a great question.
You know, constant exposure to failure is not good for mental health. You know, and I do think that it's not like students that are unprepared aren't aware that they're not. And so, you know, it's really an uphill battle, I think. So how can you get ahead of it as soon as you can? You know, if most of us aren't the ones selecting student athletes who show up at our schools. And so how can we get ahead of it and understand what issues may be at play as soon as possible to try to remediate when we can. But I do think that it's a big deal. It's just, again, another layer, a big layer of stress.
I also think it's the responsibility of the department to be honest with the department in that what's your threshold? What can you support? What services do you have? And having some of those conversations with coaches in terms of, you know, this is the amount of students we can support that need additional services. And then also in the recruiting space, what are they going to do to compensate for especially that first year that it may be more time, may be more difficult. So do they have the tools in place, the grit in place to offset that this is going to be a difficult role? We do have a plan, here are the services. And I do think that's a part of the recruiting space of if you want to bring someone that maybe has triggers or signs that they may struggle a little academically or need additional support, what's the plan to support these student athletes? And then it becomes a team effort in supporting the student athlete.
Oh, thank you for that, Nikki and Charles. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention not only is Nikki an athletic director, but she's also, you know, a practitioner. She's been doing this for a long time, and so she's got a lot of knowledge, as all of you do. And before I move to this sort of last big picture question, I just want to remind everybody to click on the Drake Group link that's being provided to learn more about what the Drake Group does and some of the views of the Drake Group. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Donna Lopiano. I've known of Donna's work, you know, way back Women in Sports Foundation, but to work with Donna and the working group and the board of the Drake Group has been an incredible experience. Very hardworking, caring people who not only care about, you know, the economics of college athletics and all the other issues, but mental health. And so, Donna, thank you so much for the leadership that you displayed and all the incredible work that you do. I want to close with asking, and everyone can chime in if they like. So what do you see in terms of the future of mental health in college sports? Like, where do you see it going, or what would you like to see? You know, because it seems, as much as these issues have been around for a while, it seems like we're really just starting to go after them, hit them head on. What would you like to see, or what do you think is going to happen with regard to mental health and college athletics moving forward?
Yeah, I will say from my lens and perspective, we are at the starting line. Within the ACC, we're to the point where all of our schools have clinicians, and every school is at capacity, regardless of how many clinicians that they have. And so we're seeing that student athletes are utilizing the services. And so we're at the forefront. It's going to continue to get better as we continue to go into this this athlete empowerment age, where our athletes are asking for more services, more support for their welfare and well-being.
I'll throw in, I think more sort of formal coach education on these issues, so that in some cases, I think that can help with prevention. In many cases, it can help with a quicker referral before a stress fracture turns into a dislocation, but on the mental health side. And so I think that's something that I think is really accessible and something we could probably do pretty quickly. Expanding our perception of and our education of types of service providers, going back to that notion of spectrum. There are certainly athletes on our campuses who need consistent and persistent mental health intervention throughout their time with us. There's not that many of them, though, that need that the entire time that they're there. And then there are some that could benefit, again, from more of a social work sort of intervention. And so I think the more we educate across provider spectrum, I think it also makes it more affordable for athletics departments to employ more people we know that we need X number of athletic trainers for Y number of student athletes. We probably need a similar kind of formula for mental health providers, because again, we can do a certain amount of prevention, but the reality is the population is going to have mental health issues. That's normal. And so how can we treat and train and address as quickly and effectively as possible, I think is sort of the question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is so much forecasting as it is hoping, but I would hope that one day we can get to a place where, beyond the services that might be available to student athletes, just the environment. So, how we have gyms and training facilities and weight rooms along the same line, I would hope that one day we have something like meditation rooms. When I worked in the College Counseling Center, we had an emotional support dog that just kind of roamed about. And when students came in, it just brightened up their days to pet the dog. And so stuff like that, I would hope that one day we can kind of start to, buy into making it more mainstream. And so, just to summarize, I think the environment, I think, is important. So if we kind of promote that, I think that also pulls students in and engages them more. So we'll see what happens.
Great points. Great points. Well, we're at our time, and I want to be respectful of folks' time, our panelists, as well as our attendees. I want to thank all of you. Again, I'm such a big fan of everybody here on this panel. You've been instrumental in things that I've done. I know that we are sort of a family in a sense of clinicians and mental health providers. Just some really outstanding work. I keep using that word, world-class, the best of the best you are. I want to wish everybody continued success in what you're doing. I also want to remind you to practice self-care. We all have to practice self-care, right? And if there's anything that I or the Drake Group could do to assist you in terms of issues in college athletics, please don't hesitate to call. And again, I want to thank Kirsten. I don't know, Kirsten, if you need to come in and close us out, but man, I'm full. It's been great. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thanks, Emmett.